The problem is you do see a lot of antisocial people succeed. Loneliness is as big a risk factor for ill health and death.
We live inside our heads.
You go cold turkey, you go into withdrawal.
There is a lot of value in the stuff that we struggle with.
Better Thinking. Conversations with experts exploring all things psychology. Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name's Nesh Nikolic, and today I have the privilege of speaking with Professor Paul Rhodes, a clinical psychologist, family therapist, and academic at the University of Sydney. In this conversation, we explore how psychology can move beyond the individual, looking through a systemic and relational lens to understand how people exist within families, communities, and even ecological systems. Paul shares insights from his work in family therapy, eco-psychology, and affect theory, offering a powerful perspective on how emotions and behaviours are deeply connected to the world around us. As the founder of the Climate Emotions Lab, Paul also discusses the emotional dimensions of climate change and how our psychological health is intertwined with broader social and environmental issues. He's currently writing a book, Liberating Psychology, Anti-Fascism in a Post-Human World, which reimagines psychology through a relational and political lens. I really enjoyed speaking with Paul, and I'm excited to share this conversation with you. So let's dive right in. Paul, a big thank you for coming onto the program today. I'm really excited about this conversation, as so much of my work is really based on the individual and therapy with an individual. And today's topic, looking beyond the individual, is exciting. I think it brings a new lens. So thank you for coming on.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for having me.
Let me ask you, firstly, what brings your passion or your curiosity towards looking beyond the individual and taking a step more so in the background rather than the foreground?
Yeah. It's always been that way. Always been the case since I was about 16, actually. And I remember I've always wanted to work with relationships. I can go into why. It will be psychodynamic, so maybe when we get to know each other better. But no, I've always been interested in it, and I've always wanted to understand psychology as what happens between people, not what happens inside people. And if you talk to if your friend comes to talk to you about a problem, or if you talk to your friend about a problem, it's usually about relationships, is it not? And problems at work are usually about relationships, and problems at home. And it seemed to me that psychology is never really fully embraced the reality of that, whereas it's been a focus on intrapsychic, which goes right back to Freud, that we've been concerned with our internal world rather than our relationships with one another. And anybody who's worked with mental health, and especially serious mental health problems, knows that it takes a family and a community to restore, someone after a terrible, encounter with serious mental health problems. So yeah, I guess that explains a little of it.
And this intrigue came quite early in life. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit, if you don't mind.
Well, I grew up, I had a very unusual childhood because I grew up in 9 different countries, traveling with my parents from one country to another, and as an expat, and my own parents lost their parents in World War II. So we were a very small family, me and my brother and my 2 parents traveling around the world. It's very hard on the attachment system to go to a different school every 2 years. So I think I had this yearning for relationships, and I was hungry to look beyond the individual. Like, it would have been terrible to focus on the individual for my whole career, given that kind of isolated, nomadic, small family that I came from. So somehow I was I know I can make sense of it that way, that I was always curious about relationships and family and community belonging in my own self. And so that then, became the fuel for, because it's a very fine line between your own self and who you become as a therapist. I think the line is very thin between ourselves and our work. We'll come back to that later, perhaps.
And what does this lens of looking at what happens between people begin to highlight? What does it show when you start looking in from that frame, from that lens, rather than that internal world, that's private between the person and the mind, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, it shows that the private cognitive individual work lens, it's just one lens. It's just one lens that we've got caught up on. And so take depression, for example, a young person who's depressed. My experience is sometimes that young person is someone carrying very heavy burdens, who has no one to turn to, who has maybe a relationship has broken down, and they're lonely and isolated. They search the internet, for meaning, but they're cut off from other people, and that the depression can't be understood without that breach between them and the very heavy burdens that they're carrying in life. And so, like attachment-based family therapy, for example, which is quite strong in Australia, looks at helping that young person to reattach to people and turn to people and rely on people and help and share the load. Now, that's a completely different conceptualization of depression from the cognitive model, but they're both different lenses with different value for different people. But I guess I'm interested in challenging the idea that psychology and individualism need to be connected all the time. Why can't we have other models and other lenses to look from? And family therapy and systemic practice is a very, very rich tradition that family therapy could gain an enormous amount from engaging with more. It's as strong and deep and tradition as the cognitive psychology, potentially wider in its reach. So, we're only doing ourselves a disservice by not embracing other ways of thinking about. And the mind, even the mind itself, isn't really inside the body. It's not. The mind, I believe that our identity is where, happens at the borders where we meet other people. That's where the identity is, at the border between ourselves and others. There's no blob of jelly inside us that is us. We're multifaceted. So even the idea of a self can be deconstructed and abandoned if for the sake of being provocative, if you like, that we can question everything, in order to find new ways to help people. So, yeah, I'm wary. I don't want to get too much on the.
Sorry, I was going to say that makes a lot of sense, because the model that we are taught at in terms of trying to start our new psychologists, with a level of training and the lens that they come forward with is that biopsychosocial, but we tend to get so caught up in the psycho part, and you're really saying that there's an additional lens, which is the social part, that if and obviously they all are overlapping, it's like a Venn diagram, but there's a bit more emphasis that could be explored on the social part, because that a person within themselves, rather a person between that relationship between people, and you also referenced something important about the systemic sort of view or the family therapy view. Can you expand on those a little bit more and how they lean into beyond?
I mean, I just want to qualify. I'm not against cognitive psychology and individualism in psychology.
Right.
I do a lot of that work. It's more about, I'm critical of the dominance of that model, when there are other rich models to draw on. So yeah, family therapy has a tradition. It goes back to the 60s. Gregory Bateson, the anthropologist, kind of first came up with the theory, and then a lot of new models emerged in the 60s, from structural, systemic, strategic, post-Milan narrative solution focus. There's a long tradition of many lenses of types of models that, it's very interesting. A lot of them came from psychiatry. So back in the 60s and 70s, psychiatrists were much more radical, than they are now, where, they're more conservative than we are even, so, and psychiatry was a font of so much change, and they were fighting, they were pushing back against the Freudian legacy, of this kind of individualism that took you back to catharsis in childhood and it's kind of deeply deterministic theorizing. They were breaking free from that father, if you like, and developing this very rich set of models that explored patterns. Systemic thinking is really about the therapist as a change agent when people get stuck in patterns of interaction that include the presenting problem, which is the child's problem. And the child's problem is seen just as one step in a dance, between people. And the family becomes the patient, not the individual, because the idea is that we don't want to be joining with a family to scapegoat a child that's got a problem because the family's become stuck. We want to help the family adapt and change so the presenting problem's no longer needed. That's essentially the old school systemic thinking from the 70s, where the Italians, the Milan school, had that kind of way of thinking about it, which is very, very different from, an individualist approach.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think there has been a dominance of the cognitive side? If I jump in there very quickly.
Yeah. Oh my God, we could talk so long about this. I mean, well, number one, it's easy to research, because CBT, has a structure about it and a logic about it that makes it easy to research. So that's fine. And that's why now we have so many apps with CBT, because they're perfect research machines, But so that's one. But also, CBT rose at the same time as neoliberalism. So neoliberalism in Margaret Thatcher, that whole period of neoliberalism in society coalesced with the rise of CBT, and so neoliberalism as a political movement is about the individual. There is no such thing as community. That's what Margaret Thatcher said, right? So, and I think clinical psychology and neoliberalism have become intertwined in a way that I'm critical of. And I think the critics of neoliberalism call it a deliverology. We have a deliverology. We have to deliver outcomes. Not not healing. And so I think that the problem for psychologists is then they come up through the sciences. They're not taught critical theory and sociology, so they fail to see. To see the big picture of their own field, that we've become caught up with neoliberalism, and because we're a bit blind sociologically, because we're not in the humanities, So I think that's one of the reasons as well, and also I think also, like Ian Parker would say, we're an industry. We're a he calls us not the military industrial complex, but the psi industrial complex. We are an industry that makes money, and so a deliverology makes sense within our field. So I think that we need to be thinking critically about ourselves much more, and thinking, especially now as society is changing so radically. We want to be very careful who we get into bed with, because we need to be really thinking about our position within society and what are we doing by doing therapy. Are we colluding or not? There's very big questions at the moment, I think, with the kind of political turn that we're all reeling at, around the world. So yeah, I guess that's what the system goes. The psychology is part of a system. It's part of a socio-political system. So, I mean, I'm hesitant to become too political in this conversation, but I think we need to be reflective of our own field, and why it's developed in the way it has. It's not all there is much because of research, and because research is much easier to do. And also, it works for certain things, which is awesome. Like that's great. It does help people. CBT helps people. It can help. It can save lives. If it's done well, that's awesome too. So it's not to be criticized in that sense, but we could expand, as you say, the social part of the biocycle. We become blind to that, to the potential to expand beyond, the reductionism of individualism. So,
Something that I always try and consider, reflect on, I'm interested in, I'm highly curious of is our own biases. Not so I can point at someone, uh, but more so I can point at myself and go, through the human condition, what are biases and how easily we can fall into those. Uh, and hence why I'd like to double click on what do you mean by colluding? Uh, what are you referencing there?
Yeah. Well, firstly, I want to say I'm a big follower of Jacques Derrida, who's a French philosopher, who says that we need to have an ethic of hospitality, of generosity towards one another. So before I go into the next step, I do want to say my attitude as a therapist is the same attitude I have as a colleague towards my cognitive brothers and sisters, right? So having said all that,
Can I just quickly
I'm
jump in?
concerned.
Look, it's so interesting, and I do this all the time with all people. We have this tendency to say, please don't misunderstand me. I need the other side, because if I'm talking about one, there is this bias that people can forget that I can simultaneously see the other position.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just trying to have a conversation, but it's so fascinating. I'm put all these disclaimers in all the time whenever I'm talking to anyone, self, others, and it's just fascinating to to see that as well. That it's almost like
Yeah.
there's a bias that we've learned potentially to say, try not to be misunderstood. There's
Of
a
course.
value in trying to describe, hey, this is not my full position. This is just a
No.
point of many. But I just wanted to quickly point that out because it's just fascinating. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, it's very important to do that because, you don't want to hurt people,
Yeah.
and also you want to call people in, not call people out.
Yes.
And I guess it's me saying let's have a conversation and call people into this
Mm.
conversation about collusion. So my concern is that individuals in society are becoming, separated from each other. The breakdown of community, the increased use of technology. I'm not against technology, but that especially young people, they're afraid of the climate crisis. They're watching a turn to neo-fascism in the world. They're becoming concerned, even apocalyptic level thinking, is becoming entering their minds, and they need each other. They need their families. They need community and belonging. And if we just simply giving them individual therapy and then individual therapy supported by apps, there's a danger there. I feel there's a danger there of us just becoming part of the problem, not supporting the development of new things, new
Mm.
ways of relating, new ways of healing, and new ways of sharing each other's burdens. So that's what worries me. That a blind psychologist, a sociologically blind psychologist, is a worry.
Mm.
And because and that out of step with the way a lot of young people think too. I think that I think a lot of young people are discovering these things, and we're behind them. So the young people I talk to are already angry, and there's a guy called Bernardi, Biffo Bernardi. He's an Italian philosopher, and he says that depression is an act of resistance. Because we're like, I'm putting my tools down to this. I'm not participating in this consumerist, hyper attentive, hyper connected world anymore. I'm out. It's paradoxical, of course, because depression is very dangerous, but and because but it's an interesting idea. Like
Mm.
why, I find I love provocative and interesting ideas because that kind of paradox gets you thinking, oh, maybe there's more to it than we think. Maybe young people are struggling much more than we privileged
Mm.
psychologists imagined. But we never ask them about how they feel about the world. So yeah. So
Is
yeah, hopefully that answers a bit about the collusion issue,
yeah,
the
yeah.
dangers. Yeah.
It's such an important topic because I think there's such a strong invitation that our clients put forward to say, you know, be well, and this human nicety of I don't want to go out and break therapeutic alliance or rupture, and inadvertently, even by validating one's feelings, can have, potentially, if it's not considered, a collusion aspect of it. It can infer correctness of a viewpoint rather than correctness of experiencing an experience. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and, if we don't sort of follow that, we can get caught up in, either just the cognitive aspect rather than looking beyond and looking at, systemic, thinking and the social
Mm.
connections, belonging, what your role is in a community, how engaged you are, and so on. And so I think there's these inadvertent messages. I'm consistently thinking about that all the time. Because
Yeah.
I have that experience all the time where a client says, Nesh, I really took on board what you said last time.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, take a big deep breath kind of tense because I'm like, I'm not sure what it is that you think
Yeah.
was, because I wasn't necessarily imparting this is a specific angle.
Yes.
This was
It's
something
usually
that
some side comments.
yes, we were
Yeah.
deliberating something. Uh, and unfortunately, that can sometimes be, no, I read between the lines. You were telling me to do X. I'm like, oh, um, but this collusion can kind of be occurring, with if I don't think, but also if I am kind of quite cognizant.
Yeah,
It's a
yeah,
process of going. I've got to keep checking in.
yeah, definitely agreed.
Hmm. Can you maybe talk us through a little bit about how you practice, the family therapy side? Because that's not something that is, while widely used in Australia.
No,
There are lots of clinicians that do, but I don't think we're all very familiar uh,
no.
with what that
Well,
looks like.
maybe I'll tell you what a family therapist would do, and then I'll tell you about
Beautiful.
the work that I do with families because it's different, of course. But traditional, and actually in Sydney University in our clinic, I run a traditional systemic family therapy clinic for students, so I can talk about that because that's very traditional. It has a two-way mirror, and uh, and the family comes in to the room, and the therapist, which is the student, and me are there, and behind the screen are three other students, and they become the reflecting team. And then both the family and the reflecting team meet at the beginning, hello, and then we do the session, and we test a lot of our hypotheses about patterns, and we work. We're not doing therapy on the family. Together, we're exploring the relational context for the presenting problem. And then we're trying to understand why are people stuck. What events happened in their life to make them stuck. What are the patterns in the everyday family interactions that include the presenting problem? And how might we find a way to break those patterns, perhaps through attachment means? Well, so then we have this conversation with the family, and then we swap rooms, and the reflecting team comes, and the family go behind the screen, and they listen to the team. This is quite a lot for students to handle. Listen to the team with no prep and nothing written and no computers, no paper, give their opinion. And that is old school, traditional Milan and post Milan family therapy, which we still teach. I've done 38 groups of students in my career so far. So that's 17 years. So that's times five. So that's 200 students have learned family therapy in that clinic. and that's my tribute to Maria Salvini Palazzoli and her Italian colleagues in Milano, where I go nearly every year because I'm for my pilgrimage, and that's traditional family therapy, if you like. But in my own private practice, obviously, I can't do that because it's too labor intensive to have 5 therapists. It's a teaching tool, but I work in my private practice with young people, kind of some of it's suicide prevention, some of it's recovery from serious mental health problems, a lot of work with families who have children who are neurodivergent. It's at the pointy end. But because they're 16 to 25, I include individual therapy with family therapy. So I do both together, maybe 1 session of individual, 2 sessions of family therapy, another individual, because the young person is a bit older, than they're 16, 17, 18, maybe at uni even, and having a major mental health crisis or recovering from one when they were younger. And so my aim is to use the family, not because they're stuck, but because they're, I say this with kindness, lost. Families are lost, because they don't know what to do. And the mental health system is very problematic for families to engage with. And, sometimes deeply problematic. And so I kind of work as a guide with the family to help them first take charge of the mental health system, and be proper, make decisions, not rely on other people to make decisions for them, get close to their kids, have faith that they're going to recover, understand recovery is not about getting rid of all your symptoms, but learning to live with it sometimes, and bringing them around the child, the young person to help them get better. So that's kind of, I mean, there's more to it than that, but and then also, keeping them alive. I mean, to be honest, sometimes, sometimes that's the beginning of the work, So if I was just seeing that young person on their own as an individual therapist, the burden is all on me. I mean, what a terrible, stressful burden. But if I can help the family and coach the family to become the team, with other team members, psychiatrists, like we create a community around that young person, a place of safety, a safe haven for them to heal, and that's a much better model. And also that includes referrals to individual therapists sometimes too, if needed, like they become part of the team. So, that's my approach, is recovery oriented, family inclusive, work with young people. And I love it. I mean, it's super stressful. I joke to my wife, "Oh God, I'm off against the clinic," like but actually when I'm there, I love it,
But it's
such
a
hard
very
work.
different dynamic. It's still extremely compassionate, and it's tapping into what are the resources around, rather than just an individual. Put places in the context, the relational frames, and it's not a lens of the individual is sick or disordered in this sort of traditional sense.
No.
It's saying someone's gone through a hard time. Let's bring in those loved ones around them, collectively put all those resources behind them, and not in a pointed finger way of, this is the person who's at fault, but rather say we're actually all in this context because we want to be as loved ones, and as a community.
Yeah.
We work together. No one's kind of left behind, because we actually need to support as family members each other as well,
Yeah.
not just the presenting problem. The
Yeah,
one.
exactly. And that includes
Mm,
that includes siblings too, who are
yeah.
really how the silent, traumatized members of families sometimes, who are really
Mm,
deserve, like you say, to not to be left behind, So yeah, I mean, this is all influenced by a contemporary model of family therapy called open dialogue, open dialogue is more of a community-oriented family therapy, which comes from my mother's home country of Finland, and which I've been very involved in over the years, and it's influenced my practice enormously. So open dialogue is really the more modern version of systemic family therapy, which is a network therapy, we call it. It's building networks around people, communities of concern, building them around people, where everybody is equal. All the voices are equal. Especially there's no difference between the voice of a voice hearer, for example, and the voice of a psychiatrist in terms of its value, in terms of its validity. I reject the idea that a psychiatrist is in charge of me or in charge of a client, you know. So I love my psychiatrist friends, and I'm generous towards them. And there are some absolutely amazing psychiatrists I work with, but they're not the boss of me. You know what I mean? They're like, and they're not the boss of anyone. And there are some amazing psychiatrists who have gone along with open dialogue and who have accepted that the power dynamics need to shift, between families, clients, and doctors. And they're wonderful people. But if you try and tell them, I won't, I really have no time for the hierarchy, no time for it whatsoever. I won't tolerate it. But I will engage in hospitable relationships with psychiatrists because they're so important. Oh my God, like without medication, for severe mental illness, we're in, it's dangerous. So, and without hospital admissions, so important. Flat hierarchy. That's what we want.
Yeah, it's an approach which says all voices are heard, but that doesn't mean that we abandon wise counsel, and so we still seek out wise counsel, and but we want to hear all of the positions. But if wise counsel becomes the expert, we're in trouble because now we're vulnerable to one person versus all of us are being enriched by understanding other perspectives and understanding about each other in a compassionate sense, but we're not going out and making ourselves open to, the expert in the room, which if you hold that position, even if it's not with a psychiatrist or a psychologist or the doctor, it ends up being with someone in the family. And once again, we've got, this is right, this is wrong, versus we're actually doing this as a collective and we're, talking this through and it's a completely different position to take, while it still celebrates, all the great learnings and teachings that others have to offer. But we do have a bit of a funny time, at least I feel, in society at the moment, where you almost there's this leaning of, you've got to bring an expert into a room for everything. If something's broken, what does the expert say? We might go to Google, but it's like, no, you've got to get a plumber for this and you've got to get an electrician for this. And for some of those things, absolutely, they've got, licenses about that sort of stuff. But, there could be tiling that needs to be done. And if I actually just watch it, I can tile. And there's a difference between saying, I wish not to tile, but I can, versus I can't tile and I have to go to an expert. And that's a very good position.
Well, I mean, expertise also lies in facilitating dialogue between people in ways that can be healing. That takes great expertise. It takes great expertise to build trust and develop relationships and help people overcome their trauma. Like that. That's skillful. It's actually easy to give advice. It's very hard to go on a long suffering journey with someone and help them to recover. And occasionally, occasionally, like we do, strategies for ADHD, and we do like how to, of course. I mean, and we do, I do re-scripting of trauma. I do, behavioral activation. It's all there. But it's the positionality that's important, to hold a position of humility, and of that's what is deeply relational. about becoming a part of those communities. And people listen a lot. People listen to your advice a lot more if you deliver it within that kind of dialogue, because they learn to trust you, So yeah.
There's a lot more. There's an invitation to buy in, but not from the expert saying, "I've got the answers." It's an expert posing questions uh,
Yeah.
that allows, in a trusting environment where those rules are set out and practiced, that we can hear one another, and the fruits of the labor come from that, and then we engage. Uh, can I ask what are some of the approaches you've learnt over time in your experience about, hiccups in those environments? How do you uh, set up an environment that, in a room where there are numerous voices that aren't practiced at listening
Yeah.
and hearing and being curious, how do you set that up to invite that type of relationship to
I
occur?
mean, I've been a parent, 2 times with my children and 2 times with my second wife, so, and I've made countless mistakes and raised my voice and behaved badly, and like I know being in a family is hard. It can be hard, and being in a family where someone's unwell is terribly difficult, and it brings out the worst parts of you, like, so I think, there is part of the work is helping people to respond differently to stress, and to suffering, and to the suffering of their children, and sometimes even providing a culture of accountability to parents, is important, and inviting them into responsibility, and that's a very important component. So I'm not suggesting all families shall rock up and they all just get on with building a community. Like everybody's stressed and traumatized and have their own family of origin biases and problems they bring, and have their own mental health problems. Like it's a messy work. It's messy, and it takes me longer than 10 sessions, by the way. But but like it's messy, and there's a lot of a therapist has to, people are paying you or hiring you to to be direct sometimes, to be direct, to say what you think, and to um, motivate people to change. That's very important. Everybody needs to be adaptable and change. So yeah, there's the soft, loving side of the therapy, and then there's the tougher, darker side, which is also necessary. Like you need to be a combination of accountability and compassion, which are both very important. So yeah, I don't want to paint the picture that it's all teddy bears and that, like it's sometimes it can be whoa, it can be you have to be direct. So yeah, I think that's important to say, because every family, including my own, has its problems, So I mean,
Hmm.
I actually don't believe there is that much of a difference between our patients and ourselves. I think there's a very fine line. All psychologists have lived experience. Many, I do, and I'm sure most do, and some have more than others. And so the line is just a line of privilege, and a line of training. But we're still two broken humans, meeting together, like that. It's got to be like that way, or there's no room for that kind of relationship. So I'm
Hmm.
very big advocate for. Um, in fact, I have run a class at uni called Multiple Discourses in Mental Health, where it's dialogue based, and is myself and a psychiatrist or a psychologist from the community, and lived people with lived experience, and students coming together for dialogue. So we have one on hearing voices, one on substance use, one on gender, one on neurodiversity. We have all sorts of different dialogues where different people come from the community to tell their story, and the psychiatrists are there too. And so we're trying to say insider knowledge and outsider knowledge uh, can exist together in tension,
Mm.
And then I meet these amazing people who have both. Psychologists, I work with psychologists who is very open and out as a bipolar person with bipolar. Another person who's an autistic psychologist. They are awesome. To me, they're at the forefront, They're the leaders because they're saying, enough pretense. Let's not pretend anymore. Like we're not God's gift, you know what I mean? We're fallen angels. So I really love this. I like shaking that up. Very important to me to do that.
But it is interesting that you are introducing very specifically, if I can call them hot topics. They are, prickly topics to
Yeah,
model how can we discuss difficult topics that often we can be polarizing or people can hold quite tightly, but
yeah,
in actual fact, a respectful way, but not necessarily having to agree. You can still hold your position quite firmly while
yeah.
giving others the opportunity to also do so, and therefore not and not being able to say, well, yeah, I'll hold my position and they can hold theirs, but they're an idiot.
No, no, no.
They're,
I mean,
they're, they're,
the whole issue of lived experience. I think the fear is it's a based on an old-fashioned view of mental health that if you say you have lived experience and you're a clinician, you're incompetent. Well,
yeah.
there's a risk of incompetence, and that's ridiculous because we now know that recovery is about living with your and thriving with your mental health concerns, and that's what recovery is. So why can't psychologists be
Mm,
in recovery and be good practitioners? Otherwise, we're saying our patients can't can't live good lives and be bipolar either. So, there's a shift that's required, I think, in that taboo and amongst our peak bodies that needs to recognize much more. And there's lots of literature and the terrible word they're called prosumers, professionals and consumers combos. The
sure.
worst word ever. I mean, really. I mean, we've got to come up with something else. But there is a movement to say to push, the recovery movement and the consumer ex-patient survivor movement in Australia is very strong, and I think it's going to have that effect on our own identity
Mm.
and our own taboos around our own humanity. It's hard also to be a psychologist and have to pretend to be disembodied. I mean, I don't tell my patients anything about myself. Like I don't want to. But I'm not suggesting we disclose stuff. I'm suggesting we talk to each other about the reality of our lives as therapists. Like yeah.
It's such an interesting space. I've always struggled with the I'm going to say the DSM, but in actual fact of more recent times, I think it's uh, the misuse or misunderstanding of those that read the DSM. And firstly, I don't think that
Mm.
most have read the DSM and understood the flexible nature inside it. Um, and I think we've just easily taken that shortcut and grab your tick
Mm.
boxes and tick them, and therefore, I'm somehow doing something. And
Mm.
so I've always struggled with that one criterion around what is it to be clinically impaired, academically, socially, or from a work, and like who's
Mhm.
the judge, who's the arbiter of
Mm.
what is clinical impairment, and some of it is I get to be, and others is if they're distressed by it, and another one is can they actually hold a job or what? It
Yeah.
has posed so many questions that I've always struggled, and to start with, I wanted to burn it down, and now I'm more like there are patterns in here. This is a collection of patterns that we've put together and tried to put down in the most clumsy form, which is language,
Mm.
because relational frames are very, very hard to decipher. But I
Mhm.
think it's the reader, or at least I'm starting to change my position of the reader and understanding and debating this whole concept. I'd love to be in one of your classes and at this stage in my career and let's discuss the DSM, because
Ooh.
it is a hot topic, and I've just seen myself evolve and change. But I love this idea of uh, being curious and coming together, whether it is based on this idea of someone's unwell, when in actual fact, the whole family are having lived experience, and whether we talk it on, the psychologist comes with their own history. Of course you do. The condition is the human condition.
Yeah. Again, I'm not suggesting we just self-disclose about our lived experience. It's more just about recognition that
Yes.
we can't be anything. We're not superior beings in any way. The DSM, that no, no, we could really have a whole conversation about the DSM, but but because a diagnosis can be an incredibly liberating thing. At the moment, I work with a lot of young women who are late diagnosed or with autism. That is a very liberating thing, to make sense of your many years of suffering and bullying and being misunderstood, if you know what I mean. But but and also all these incorrect diagnoses of, especially of borderline, which is which should be thrown out. I think it has been thrown out of DSM now. But that kind of pejorative one, the misdiagnosis of young women with autism is a massive thing. So the DSM done well, in that situation is a very liberating thing. But it can also be done poorly, slapdash, quick diagnoses, nothing empirical done, and it changes lives, in
Yeah,
such a
guys.
terrible way. And I fear that young people come to me and go, "Am I borderline? I think I'm bipolar. I think I'm bipolar. I think I'm this. I think I'm that." And I'm like, "Wow, we've done so well with the DSM. We've kind of colonized the generation, like a whole generation where there used to be goths and punks and teddy boys, and now they're like borderline and borderline and bipolar, like that. I'm not suggesting those things aren't real, they're real, but young people kind of reach for that knowledge when they're suffering, and when they're distressed, when it might not be the only hermeneutic, the only method for making meaning. There are many ways to make meaning from suffering, not just a medical model.
Mm,
There's many other ways. Existentialism, spirituality, that I think we need to be careful not to get involved in. We need to be careful not to colonize those beautiful parts of our community. And not say mental health is the answer for all suffering. I mean, that's ridiculous. To me, that's where we enter another danger point
mm.
of if we don't think about society much more wider. Where we start to think, that's why this whole thing, let's make apps so that everybody who's even not even unwell can use an app to deal with their distress. I'm like, but aren't we destroying community by doing that? Like, aren't we becoming community replacement officers, like through the apps? Like, we need to be, again, there's where another area where I think some dialogue and debate's required. I guess we're talking about systemic thinking in the sense that
Mm.
psychology is within a system, within a culture, within a political system that we need to think about too.
There is definitely a culture there. I'd love the app that you open it up and it just says, reach out to a friend.
Yeah, that's good.
And that's it. There's two
Agreed.
buttons: reach out to a friend, reach out to a family member. Examine some purpose and meaning. Get out there. What are you? What just talk about your spiritual take. Just anything. Just
Yeah,
that. But yeah, there is a culture, and that's at the heart of this, is trying to understand the culture we find ourselves in, and looking beyond just that individual lens, the
yeah,
culture to be understood, that contributes to how we all experience and feel in life.
yeah.
Switching gears a touch, if you don't mind.
Let's do it.
Before we started recording, eco psychology came up, as a potential uh,
Yeah.
part of this conversation. Can you talk me through that also being a lens that pulls away from just the individual?
Yeah, my research lab is called the Climate Emotions Research Lab. So all of my research is now in eco-psychology. I have PhD students doing research, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But eco-psychology, interestingly enough, was also kind of started by Gregory Bateson, the famous anthropologist who also came up with the idea of family therapy. I mean, how the hell did he do all that? Plus being an anthropologist, and then eco-psychology, if you think of the idea that Freud's idea that we are unwell because we're cut off from our unconscious, or we're cut off from our drives. Rotzak, who's the most famous ego-psychology, says, no, we're also potentially unwell because we're dissociated from the natural world, and that healing can come from reconnection with the natural world. So I think that's a very fascinating systemic idea that and it's a deeply Aboriginal idea, of course, and our Aboriginal colleagues would say, yeah, well, who's Rotzak? Like, we've been thinking about that for millions of years, like, of course, like, I mean, that's guaranteed. But the idea of depression is being sick for country, it's an Aboriginal idea, but it's the same idea that perhaps depression is being cut off from the natural world, maybe, and the climate crisis, speaks to the need for us to reconsider an anthropocentric way of living, where the human being is at the center, the human individual is at the center, and people like Donna Haraway, very good philosopher, says that, well, why can't our family extend to beyond the non-human family? Why can't we have, all these ideas we're talking about, belonging and connection? Why can't it include animals and plants, and the community? Why can't we reconfigure our relationships beyond just the family out to the natural world? So my lab is looking at questions that relate to that. But let me give you an example. So I have a student, Brittany, who is doing another one, Kath. I'll talk about both their projects because they're really great students. Brittany comes from a farming background, and she's concerned about men's depression, but she's treating it. She's looking at, can it be treated through regenerative agriculture? Think about that. That's an incredible idea. So that men who are depressed because they're watching the depletion of their land, what if you teach them regenerative agriculture, where they recognize that they are part of nature, and to heal themselves, it requires the healing of their land? Can that help depression? Obviously, one component of dealing with depression. We're not suggesting, it's very provocative, but she's going out to farms to talk to men who've picked up regenerative agriculture, to ask them about what's happened to their well-being. Again, this resonates very much with Aboriginal way of thinking. So that's a practical example of how these ideas might be of use. And then Kath is doing work with communities in the Northern Rivers who went through the floods. Looking at and exploring the whole movement of community-based recovery. Which is the recovery of the land, the recovery of your relationship with the river, and your own personal recovery, all tied together. So, it's about, we can't recover without nature recovering also, so the eco-psychology is like family therapy, if you like. It's just widens the lens right out, and it takes the human out of the center and puts them on the outskirts, floating around with all the other things, as equals. Just like open dialogue says, the voice hearer, the person who's unwell, the mother, the sister, the psychiatrist, the psychologist are all equal. So it's the same in eco-psychology. We don't need an expert in the center, being in charge, usually of some white male bloke. We don't need that anymore. Look, it's not helped. So you can see how the thinking from Milan systemic therapy to open dialogue to eco-psychology is all just an expansion, an expansion of the number of beings, that you include. It's fascinating. I only got onto this because I moved to the Blue Mountains. I'm back in Sydney now, and I was living there during the Black Summer, and it hit me so hard. The reality of the climate crisis hit me so bad. I became a fellow at the Sydney Environment Institute, which is a climate institute, for a year, and that's where I really um, got involved as an activist researcher, and so yeah, it's really. I thought that was the biggest crisis we could ever have, but it turns out since then it's not. Like now we have new problems, on top of all that with the rise of fascism, etc. That like it's a lot to handle.
Mm.
So yeah.
There's a common thread that at least is coming out for me that speaks to, connection that we've discussed earlier, but also meaning and purpose. That there's a level of connectedness that we're seeking, and we might not necessarily know what that is. Maybe connectedness with others, maybe connectedness with nature or the natural world, connected with a purpose, a reason, something to wake up for that more often than not includes others. The individualistic connectedness seems odd, right? The connectedness comes with something. Yeah, and we sit at the easiest level of wanting to share a meal with someone, or if you see
Yeah.
something, we immediately point. We say, "Oh, look at that! I want to share my experience with someone else. It enriches it. If it's just mine, then it's not." And if we take a photo, if we're going for a bushwalk by ourselves, take a photo. You want to show someone. Look at the flower that I saw.
Exactly. That's
There's
who we are.
something in there. Yeah, yeah. There's something
Mm.
so biological in connectedness, and then purpose and meaning, that
Yeah.
whether this is for someone who's feeling depressed around the degradation of land, and seeing that outwardly, being able to be mindful about what's your patch of land and how can you do regenerative farming or whatever it might be, and that gives you purpose. And then I imagine you collect lots of people around you who are like-minded, who also believe it, because that's what most farmers actually believe it. We might use chemicals because it's quicker and easier, and financially the incentives are there, but
Mm.
most people connect to the land, go, if I could do the same thing without the spraying, as an example, I
Yeah,
would do
yeah,
that. Yeah.
for
Mm.
sure.
Talk, can you talk me through a little bit more about the work that your lab does, and how that extends?
Well, we've only been in existence for a couple of years, so we've had a couple of master's students and a couple of PhD students, and that's it. We were involved in a community of practice where we met with community psychology groups and grassroots community groups, and Aboriginal well-being group that were all looking at climate crisis. Psychologists for a Safe Climate is an example of a member of that community who support psychologists to become more aware of the climate crisis and its impact on mental health. So yeah, we did have a community of practice that, and a paper's just come out about that community of practice. And then so we had the community of practice, we have the research component, but we're not gigantic. We're a small group of three or four, me and three or four students, and then there's three or four external academics in the Northern Rivers, or or in the areas in which we're doing the research. But yeah, it's nothing grand. We haven't got money flying out of a clinic. We're just a focal point for doing that kind of work. We did do a really good project with young people, where we worked with young people to come up with the guidelines for what psychologists need to know about the climate crisis, because they were young people involved in lived experience mental health with Headspace, and also just involved, in activism or concern with the climate. And we did a project where we looked to them to advise psychologists about what they need to know, because young people were complaining that psychologists never asked them about it. They never asked them like about the world. Deleuze and Guattari, philosophers, they would say psychologists only ask them about mummy and daddy. Not about the bigger influences on everybody's life.
It's so interesting because whenever we start to actually ask people, we're in some sense tapping into what's your viewpoint, what's your philosophy, what do you make of what you see around you, and
Yeah.
that's the meaning making stuff. It's so important, because then I get to kind of see inside you, and also the systems in which you live with. If systems you don't believe people can hear you or hear the problem that you can see, that can create quite a high stress level. There's a desperation of no one can understand, no one can hear. Yet there's an emergency going on for me.
Exactly.
Mm.
Mm.
Wow. And can I also, I know we're kind of jumping through fairly quickly,
It's
but
okay.
I
You think you're going to save the most difficult one to last. Yeah. Yes.
it just stimulates, it stimulates thought and conversation and reminds as well, all those good things which I wish that all dialogue does. That leaving the last being effect theory.
Yeah.
Can you
Yeah.
in 50 words?
50 words. Yeah. I can. I can. Well, I mean, affect theory comes from a philosophical movement called roughly posthumanism or new materialism. If you think about psychology historically, it's always been applied philosophy, like Marcus Aurelius, came up with the basis of CBT, like uh, acceptance and commitment therapy comes from Buddhism, like all the models have a philosophical base. So we are really in the job of applying philosophy to the clinic. But since the CBT came along, we stopped doing it. Like, so we don't have a postmodern therapy method, even though Foucault, Derrida, and all of those people were dominated philosophy through the 80s, 70s, and 80s and 90s. And now we have posthumanism, and we still don't have a model. And posthumanism and Deleuze and Guattari and Bradiotti and many other philosophers. So their take on emotion is very different from ours. So psychologists views emotion as inside the body and a private matter, whereas the the new materialist view sees emotion as something that is in the world and impacts us. Like so, for example, I'm writing a book at the moment on it's called Liberating Psychology, Anti-Fascism in a Post-Human World. Like, so I'm interested in the 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 many countries that are embracing totalitarianism at the moment. The last 5-10 years. Um, this is a pre-cognitive emotion roaming around the world, finding conduits and vessels, like in leaders, but it's bigger than those individuals. There's perhaps because of the climate change, perhaps because of uncertainty, these emotions are being created in the culture more generally that only and the vessels of the people that we see, like, like in leaders of countries and out of the human and is put into a much wider cultural semiotic kind of place so that we can think much wider than the human brain. It's quite radical and sometimes hard to get your head around the craziness of affect theory, but it's very, very interesting to me, fascinating. I love ideas that seem so odd, and unusual, but that deep they can give you such new insight, beyond this idea, because you can't explain the international rise of fascism through cognition, So but it's a deeply emotional issue, deeply tied in with hatred and resentment and trauma, that we need to, as psychologists, think beyond the individual to understand these psychohistorical phenomena. So, I think that's pushing the system out as wide as it can go, apart from cosmologically, but I'm not going to go to that level. But you can't get much wider to think like, as psychologists, let's think about the world that we're in and why is it falling apart? Why are we crossing so many boundaries that we thought would never be crossed? So there are lots of important thinkers, some who are psychologists, some who are philosophers. Brian Masumi uh, um, is one I'm following at the moment, who I love. I wish psychologists would break out of their discipline, and read other things. Break out of their discipline, read poetry and philosophy and other things, to understand how to do their job. Because I love the idea of post-disciplinarity, like the idea that why can't we can sometimes step out of our discipline to learn something and bring it back in. That's what we've always done historically, and that's good academia, and good research too. So, so that's as far as I'll go. I mean, I'm still learning it too. It's quite complicated, but it's fascinating.
Are there conditions that have occurred that explain or lean into more of the, affect theory that while you're talking, my mind, as it always does, tries to put a narrative to everything and tries to explain and so on. The first thing, which is obviously the most clumsy thing, but I'll share it anyway. The first thing that it comes up with is the contribution of social media, this technological advancement of all of us being able to have dialogue. That we spoke about open dialogue. As open as it is, it's so closed in. We're all found in this tiny little chamber. The algorithm says you've got open dialogue, but more of one lens. And that tends to be us versus them. There's that kind of factor of we know they don't. We're going to point out their faults and why we're right. Is there something? I mean, this is the first thing that comes to mind while I'm hearing you speak about this kind of emotion that occurs, and there's a technology that's come about that's maybe putting some energy behind this. I don't know. I'm just trying to.
Yeah. Oh, totally. You're totally on the right track. So there's a very disparaged and frankly nasty philosopher called Nick Land who's really an unpleasant person. And that's a whole other story. But he come up with this idea of accelerationism. The accelerationism is what happens with technology, and it's a dark enlightenment, a dark accelerationism. That the algorithms are creating. The polarization, so there are thinkers talking about the role of technology and accelerationism towards more dark times. Definitely. But the problem with Nick Land is he wants that. so he's not someone I recommend. He wants it because he says the world's messed up, so let's destroy it all and start again. I mean, that's crazy, right? But he's a really horrible philosopher, but someone I've had to read to understand. But yes, I think that technology has a risk of an accelerationism of those things. I mean, especially around fascism and neo-fascism, that, those kind of viewpoints are getting accelerated and amplified, and they're becoming what Deleuze and Guattari would say territorialized. In other words, they were online, but now they're in the real world. They're actually becoming territorialized into the real world as real forces that hurt real people. So, I think there is that kind of process where, the ghosts of the past, the ghosts of fascism, are emerging and accelerated through technology to then enter the real world through conduits. That's through leaders that then it becomes dangerous. So I mean, I think I'm pretty happy. I think I described that quite well for the first time. How affect theory works. So my whole book is about how affect theory works with the rise of neo-fascism. So I'm really struggling with it at the moment. Like it's really hard work.